So thanks everyone for coming to our Visiting Artist Speaker Series hosted by Studio 99. I'm Asta Roseway. I'm a Principal Research Designer here at Microsoft Research. Today we have Newton Harrison, one of the earliest and best known ecological artists. Together with his wife Helen, they have generated collaborative works that support biodiversity, environmental awareness, and community development since the early 1970s. They've had numerous international solo exhibitions, including work featured at the MoMA, the Pompidou Center in Paris, Chicago Museum of Contemporary Art, among others. Their approach to art and science has inferred that we should treat our planet as a living sculpture. With that, welcome Newton Harrison.
My goodness. Somebody will tell me if I'm running on too long. This is a talk that I'm developing on what we call the Force Majeure. The Force Majeure, which is a snitch from a legal term, like an act of God, what we hold it as an act of human behavior trying to be like God, which is the movement of global warming across the planet, the outpouring of materials and chemicals the normal life web has difficulty dealing with, the oceans warming and rising. All these things collectively make a sort of force that is heading us into catastrophe. We're already in the sixth extinction. And so lots of our work is what do you want to do about that? But first I thought I'd show you work that's so successful it's astonishing, but at the same time it fails. And I'll tell you why. The work you'll see is called, I hope I'm doing this right. Yeah, can we bring down the lights?
To film it, they need this amount of light. Oh, it's a bit, a little bit.
We got it. That's it?
That's all you get.
That's a micron, you know.
That's
It's visible though.
Okay, it's okay. So we get these telephone calls from Holland. So what's the matter with Holland? Well, it turns out they want to build a 600,000 house city in the middle of their green heart. The green heart of Holland is an 800 square kilometer, maybe more, restored land from the sea, surrounded by the Randstad, which is Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Den Haag, Haarlem, Leerdam, etc. 6 million people. It's their whole history and the history of democracy, and their great Central Park. And so it's decided they don't have any land, so they got to build this bunch of houses, and it happens to cost a mere $230 billion, and everybody hates it except the developers, who of course love it. And so we get a call saying, well, we've had 10 plans that didn't work, so you're sort of a court of last resort, would you come on over? So we go on over and we study the green heart. And after about 2 weeks, we start to meet with parliamentarians, and they say, well, what makes you think you can save the green heart? And I said, well, you guys can't. You failed 10 times, and you wore us out looking at your failures. Being polite to parliamentarians is unwise. So they said, well, will you sign a contract? We said, sure, we'll sign a contract to save your green heart, and we'll do it cheaper than these guys. We're a cheap date. So by God, they do sign this contract. But we add our typical clause. The clause is, if we don't like what you're doing, we're going home. You can have your money back. If you don't like what we're doing, tell us, we'll leave. Because the green heart is our client, not you. Okay? The environment is our client, not you. And we'll stick to this, and we're rigid about it. And so they sign. This is the installation. They have us in a church. Jesus looks down upon us. So, I mean, it's a little bit cheerful. and very, very odd. But they stick us in this little church in a small town called Gouda, where they make the cheese, because they've decided that we cost so much money that if we blow it, they can hide us. But if we make it, then people can take, like pilgrimages there, and they'll be praised for their modesty. So what we do is this. First, to understand what the Green Heart is. It's 15 villages. All those little squares are suck water out. The water gets sucked into this and pushed out to the ocean. And so it's a stunning, great place. It's a history of Europe, and it's about to be extracted. A lot of our work takes up the issue of extraction. We've extracted our forests, we've extracted topsoil, we've extracted minerals from the land to the disadvantage of rivers, and so on and so forth. So this is the Holland that we agreed to save. So they say, first thing we do, we make a map on the left. That map on the left is about 9 foot square, and it's Holland printed backwards. And we have, I'll go back to this later. I'll show a better image of it. And what we have is, we print in a couple 100,000 houses in there, and you can see it splits the Green Heart in half. If you triple that, which they would, it would wreck the whole place. Incidentally, Rotterdam, which is in the lower right in this backward, would be wrecked as a country, as a city. So they were willing to do all this for development. So they said, why'd you print us backward? They got mad at us. So we said, well, we printed your map backwards because you're designing your country backwards. And so we got a whole bunch of pissed off planners. And so the nice thing about being artists, it really is, you don't have to edit yourself. We are prepared to go home if we don't like us. If we don't like them, we're also prepared. And this is serious, because you have to maintain your own position of power in this. So, okay, they say, if that's backwards, what's forward? The Dutch are blunt. I like them a lot. We say this is forward. You see, that ring is a biodiversity ring. It's a ring past knot. Each polder is a painting there, and that'll sequester about 60 million cubic meters of water every year clean. And it'll hold a lot of wildlife. So it'll pay for itself. And on top of that, those, what the Dutch then called wiggles, those are parks going to places of ecological providence, so nature can travel back and forth to so their whole system gets connected. And so, and there's something else it does. What it does is it separates the cities. Each city is a historic place and was almost a country, has its own architecture. And so they were getting ready to bleed each themselves together. And so we made a design where that kind of bleeding together couldn't happen. So back we get to, okay, that's very nice, but where are you going to put the houses? So we make a design. It's an engineering drawing. It says that these are the heights of every field, and that'll tell an engineering company how to design. So they say, okay, that's very nice, but where are the houses? So we say, well, and on top of that, this is what's going to grow in your Green Heart. Pretty nice looking stuff. So nature will self-complicate. Yeah, but where are the houses? And so they're getting very annoyed with us again. We say, this is what your Green Heart really is. Look at it. It's an icon. And if you make it, it'll look like a sun sign from space. And all those red spots are your little villages you're going to lose. And you got wetlands that you're going to lose. And you got farmlands that you're going to lose. And you got 13 villages that you're going to lose. Yes, yes, but where are you going to put the houses? So we had an inspired landscape architecture student. We had to do this work, we asked for a team and a 4,000-foot studio, and we lived in a house. So they gave us a house in the immigrant section, and Helen and me were immigrants from California. among all the black immigrants from every other place. So it was really neat to live there. So she comes back after 2 weeks. We said, go out and find us where to put 600,000 houses. Nobody told her this was a hard task. And nobody told her that she was not mature enough in her study of landscape planning to do it. So she didn't have any inhibitions at all. So she comes back with this, with clear evidence that you can put a little over 600,000 houses in amongst the open spaces around the cities. And on top of that, it would function as infill. And some other nice things that happen. The integrity of each place would be held. And before we know it, the Amsterdam Financial Times is praising us. Why? Well, $230 billion, which would have gone to developers outside of the country, are now spun back into the country. Second, you may not need that many houses, or you may need more. This lets every place make those choices. So you democratize the planning process, re-educate the planning process, change the policy of the country, and a few other little things like that. So there's another plus. If you do that, see all the little dots? That means that there's about 160 running kilometers of parkland that new housing can be built against. And who will get these new housing? Mostly the immigrants. So, so that an accidental democratization took place, because we certainly didn't intend this. But there are outcomes to these kind of planning that are unintended consequences, and you have to leave your planning process open enough so that they happen, and you sort of say thank you. So this is what you would have lost. Amazing place, a great central park, 800 square kilometers. Millions of people used it. So we're heroes. The parliament likes it, kinda. The environmental agencies accepted it. The planners have accepted it grudgingly. The developers have been driven out. And all of a sudden, an election happens. The right wing moves in. The plan is put on the shelf, and we're asked to leave. So we go. 5 years pass. We get a call from the Ministry of Agriculture. The bad guys are out. Your plan is right. We're putting it into the country. Come on back, show the work, and we'll probably change it a bit. But the basic idea of separating the cities, making biodiversity continuous, making cultural diversity framing, and only planning, whenever you make a big plan on one part, you look at the whole. All that goes into their planning group. So, about 5 years after that, if you see the green heart right there, goodness, there you go, it's then preserved by the EU. So this is a very successful work by any standard. And it was kind of fun to push a $250 million around, for us artists anyway. But you see, the waters are rising. We should have said, don't worry about this housing here. Build 50 feet up in the Brabant next door. You have land higher. But we didn't know enough to do that. We said, at that time, it's the mid-90s, at that time we said, look, the waters are going to rise. And the Dutch said, not enough, we can raise our dikes. Now they can't, and they know they're opening their dikes. But, so you see what I'm saying about when you do a plan, you really have to see the whole place in some new way. Because we're in a new game, and the, what can I say, the sixth extinction is upon us. And how do we plan for this? I mean, the Ehrlich papers, as I've told some of you, you should read Paul Ehrlich's newest work, point out that we're losing species at the 100 times normal. And that somewhere in the next 50 to 80 years, we're going to lose about 50% of what's alive. My God. What that suggests is, if you lose that much, what is left is insufficient to support the life web that we live on. And so it will simplify. and become much less productive, no matter how smart we are with hydroponics or anything else. We're not going to outsmart an extinction in that manner. Well, our next work says, well, we may not be able to stop it, but we certainly can mediate it. Whoops, what did I do there? Oh, here. Oh, incidentally, in that plan, this was their plan, and this was the Harrison studio drawing. They copied us exactly. And they snitched it, and it was really very flattering. So at any rate. So we've opened, that's incidentally a careful model of England. There are projectors above it, and it shows what every inch of land at the border will look like with a 2-meter rise of water and a 4-meter rise of water. So that was about asking the question, could you democratize global warming information enough so everybody who was living there would have a notion about whether they should continue to live there? And that kind of information has to sink in. Otherwise, what will happen is they will be unplanned for, unthought about, and unhelped. So in this particular work, we worked on what kind of architecture do you need for the upward movement of people. After this work, we formed the Center for the Study of the Force Majeure. We hold, like an oncoming storm front, the force majeure is a fluid frontier, a frontier exponentially increasing, heat moving across the planet, a frontier of warming water advancing on lands. It is a frontier from which we must retreat, yet within which we must also adapt. It's a force and a situation open to human revision and recreation. I think there's something underneath there, but we lost it. The core question we ask in our research is, are there counter forces available? The answer is maybe, but it's a hopeful maybe. The center is focused on 3 categories of work, each with a guiding metaphor. The metaphors are intended to reframe issues and guide design, setting up our systems-driven approach. Incidentally, we have map makers, and we ask them to make the island of Britain with what it would look like if 2 meters rose 4 and 6 and 10. It doesn't look happy. Okay. 1, we have 3 approaches in our little center. 1 is preemptive planning and design at scale, the guiding metaphor. Only fools pick a fight with the oceans, the forests, the topsoil, or the atmosphere itself. Wise folk dance with indeterminacy that is upon them. So that guides the design. Well, what does guiding design mean? Funded by the European Union, the German government, and 3 different museums, all very kindly, we did a work called Peninsula Europe. Part 5, we discover that the trajectory of drought is going to hit mid-Germany. So the yellows represent about 340,000 square kilometers of pasture, mostly monoculture. The rivers are privileged where roads once were. Roads are minimized as rivers once were. All national boundaries removed, and dense urban areas marked in red. The greens represent mostly high ground forests, 600,000 square kilometers, mostly monoculture. The browns represent 2.3 million square kilometers of farmland, mostly monoculture. We chose the peninsula of Europe because we make a discovery. We discover that the Dniester River drops into the Black Sea, and the Vistula drops into the Baltic, and they start about 30 kilometers apart in the Carpathians, and that means this thing is separated from the Great Russian Plain by only 30 kilometers. We find later that we simply discovered a plate. But, like you discover this stuff and then some kind of plate tectonic expert tells you what you found out. But we did this to find out how to think about it. And so, here's what we concluded. we need to find a way to deal with about 1.5 million square kilometers of farmland that's going to hit drought. It won't hit rain. There's going to be intermittent heavy rain and then lots of drought. And now think about it. The land mass shrinks, the waters rise. People have to move upward. We calculated a 5-meter rise would be probably extreme, but a 1 or 2 wouldn't. And then we're looking at some millions of people. We then calculate that there's 1 million square kilometers going dry. And we ask ourselves, what do you do about such a thing? And we conclude that a sort of hydrologic masterpiece has to be designed with engineering at its base. Turns out that if you look at how the land was shaped over 2,000 years, the lands were flattened. Swamps were taken away, forests were taken away, and the lands were slightly tipped in order to keep the roots from rotting, so the waters wouldn't stand there, although they would sink in. And so we figured that we took a look at the aquifers underneath. We took a look at the way the land could store water if it could, and we found out that if you re-tip the land in like a couple feet here, a couple feet there, 20 feet here, somewhere else, you would then redirect the rainwaters to the low spots that were above the aquifers or recharge basins. And if you did that, you would be creating what amounts to be an oasis. And the oasis would at the same time be a wetland, permit farming in a big circle around it, and at the same time, I guess it would be productive enough we calculated it could reply with about, instead of losing 25% of the food production, Europe would only lose about 10 to 15. And so this is what we would call mediating that great force. Now, why would we? Now, there's something else that would happen here. We're facing a mass extinction. If the oases are used properly, they will be endangered species sources. So that we think that if we're able to mediate the mass extinction, perhaps by 10 to 20%, we might not hit catastrophe. Why do I say that? I say that because where would I get such an insight? And I get it from looking at the glaciers. We spent a lot of time studying glaciers. And nature recovers from a glacier in about a glaciation in the normal heat cycle in 9,000 to 12,000 years. That can be accelerated. So I think that the way nature has accelerated its response to shock and disturbance, it does so automatically, and that's where our next great studies have to be. They have to be, how does nature respond so brilliantly, so forcefully to shock? And then we have to be nature's assistant in that. In this case, by retipping the lands. So here's where we come to this. Up top in Portugal is a dry place. A group of folk meet there, and they make a water retention landscape, and it turns out into this. So the evidence is on the ground there that this kind of a system will work, but it might be a little costly. Might cost like $1 trillion. Might cost about maybe as much as a Bush war. But you get it. We have to, in my ideal world, a war gets criminalized, the Department of Defense disbands, the defense industry disbands, and monies start to go to things like this. We need a radical, that means we need changes in governance, which we'll get to shortly. Another thing in the big works, where the bays of San Francisco become a 400,000 acre estuary lagoon in response to an ocean rise of about 3 meters. Take a look. Those are the bays. That's 160 some odd, miles of dike you have to make if you're going to hold back the ocean. That is to say, if you're one of the fools who pick a fight with the ocean. Foolish people, that is. Well, what if you don't? That's the Central Valley behind it. Well, let's take a look. Here are your bays with a 1 meter rise. You can see it grow there. You could see the central farming there. You could see the Sierra Nevada in the background where we get so much of our water. 2 meter rise, getting a little bigger. 3 meter rise, well, now it really is an estuarial lagoon. It's about 200,000 acres. Whoops, a 4 meter rise does that. Now, what can you learn from that, aside from the fact that you're going to get a hell of an algal bloom from all the fertilizer in the land? Well, what's that?
A question.
What?
So these models that you've been showing about gradual water rise, I've seen other projections like this, and it seems that this is the optimistic view, that the actual, this models as if the sea level is going to gradually rise, but that's not how it's going to be. It's going to be through storms, and there's going to be other catastrophic damage because of how the water comes into the area.
Yes.
And so the actual impact is going to be much worse than what these projections show on the map.
I've heard those. You're talking about giant storm surges, and that's entirely possible. But while the damage will be greater than I'm talking about, in 100 years or so it'll stabilize, and it'll stabilize in something that looks a little like this.
But I think the damage to the human part of the ecosystem is going to be much worse.
The damage to the what?
The human part and the human
Oh,
sediments
yes, of course.
is going to be much worse.
But so what?
So it seems like
I mean, tell me what you're worried about here.
no.
It's just a bunch of dead infrastructure. We did another piece called "On the Upward Movement of Infrastructure," but
So what I was trying to ask is, the conversation never seems to go in that direction about how this sea level rise is going to happen. That by the time this level of sea level rise happens, you're going to see much more loss of life and much more damaged infrastructure before things stabilize. And how
I do see that myself. So you're right. I'm not taking issue with you at all. I'm merely saying that I'm pointing to an end game, and you're pointing to what happens when it gets there. It doesn't actually matter so much, because in due course, there once was water there, and in due course, you would end up with a highly productive estuarial lagoon. If we did the science right, it would be more productive than the irrigated farming that's presently there. So like Europe is a real catastrophe. This is not necessarily one.
Right, so I was thinking about the maps of Britain as well, that all the coastal areas, once they get damaged, the impact is going to reach far more inland. And unless there is realization about that, we're not going to have a conversation in the right direction.
I'm not following. Can somebody explain this in another way? I don't understand what your objection is.
No, there's not an objection. It seems to me that
You want me to worry about infrastructure, and I'm refusing to worry about it.
Or maybe just that your drawings could be more severe.
What's that?
Or maybe that the drawings could be more severe because the impact will be
Oh, I see. Okay. That's a fair criticism. Let me say why I didn't do it. Okay? Because, thank you for helping me. Because it is a fair criticism. If I had about 30 more images to do, you would see we have some where it knocks off the wetlands first. And millions of dollars have been spent for the wetlands. Like, those are wasted. Then it's going to knock off all the dams and the attempted damming that's happened that'll hold the waters back if they only reach a meter height. Then it'll knock off parts of a couple of the cities, Compton and Sacramento, and a couple of the smaller towns. But that being said, this is the outcome. So I think that working backward from an outcome instead of forward from capacity, from catastrophe, is a more useful way of forming thoughts. So we may disagree a little. Let me continue. We also had it's very complex. The Dalai Lama had asked us to do a peace park up in the high grounds. And when we got up there and looked at all the rivers nourishing Asia, we decided we better take a look at what ought to be done up there for the rivers and not try to make a cultural peace park, which was the first time we disobeyed a head of state. Not the last time, but the first time. Later he came to similar conclusions, by the way. So I've shortened this endlessly, but the argument we make is that if you do paleobotanical research and you locate what lived in this area when it was hotter, probably the Eemian, but before the Eemian, the Pliocene, I think, you start to find some of the species that lived there when it was that hot. You sort of interrogate the whole terrain by spending quite a lot of money. It's 2 million square kilometers of waven land at different heights. I just got back there from there. And what you do is you start making what we call future gardens, small gardens which grow the future ecosystem of that place, where nature, so that you can't grow an ecosystem, but you can grow a complex enough grouping that will self-complicate. And so we argue that the Tibetan plateau is going to undergo tremendous changes. China is taking the waters incorrectly. Lots of the Chinese folk, the scientists there, know this. Some of them that we're working for. But the long term is that the Tibetan plateau, 100 years from now, when it's warmer, and it's rehabbed in this kind of a way, can turn into, like it would sequester 3 gigatons of carbon a decade if it went green in this way. Moreover, it would become productive where food is concerned and productive in entirely new ways. And so I think it's really necessary, if we can, to start thinking at the 1 million and 2 million square kilometer level. Even if we fail, it's worth taking such a thing on. The reason I like China so much is I like the way they govern. This is going to sound very strange, but we just got back from there and we did a lot of work behind the Iron Curtain, so we know what repressed people are like, and that the people in China that we ran into, and we were not carefully guided or anything, we're pretty content folk. And it seems that up until it gets complex, democratic processes work, and after it gets gigantic, autocratic processes work. And therefore, they're able to get a bunch of stuff done that we can't possibly do because democracy self-cancels at that scale. So we have to rethink what governance is if we're going to survive at all. At any rate, I just put this up there. It's a much more complex work, but I'm suggesting the scale, and I'm suggesting it's possible to do that, and I'm suggesting there are the resources to do that, and I'm suggesting that the science is not far from it, and the art of it is what we do. These are our future garden works. It's called The Guiding Metaphors. Every place is the story of its own becoming. This is the first future garden we ever did, which was when each one's a question. We were in Middle Europe, we were in Bonn, Germany, we were doing a big work on a roof garden, and then we posed the question, well, who would live here if it was 3 degrees warmer? Which everybody back in '95 said 2 degrees is the max. Now it's 3 degrees, let's try not to get beyond it. About 10 years it's going to be 4 or 5 degrees, I suspect, unless we make stunning changes. In this case, we proposed, well, we were sure it was going to get warmer, but we didn't know whether it was going to get rainier or less rainy. So we designed a dry garden and a wet garden that would live under those circumstances. But we took our lessons from the original people in the Sierra Nevada. That is to say, they harvested nature and preserved it simultaneously. And so what we tried to do here was invent gardens that people could eat and butterflies could take and small game could eat at the same time, so that they would serve a population that way. Then, of course, we suggested that lots of bad stuff can happen, like the ozone, virus can come by, lots of stuff can work against it. But this was our first shot at thinking our way through that. I do believe we should be propagating the future in the now. And I do believe it's not that hard, and we're having good fun for it. We've got another one going in the High Sierra, in the Sagehen watershed. That's the Berkeley Research Station, 8,000 acres. We interrogated this watershed, saying who would live, once the heat was 10 degrees warmer, who are the species that we can find that can, in the watershed itself, so we're not talking exotics, in the watershed itself, can we find that? So we did. We found 11 species who had a probability of surviving at different altitudes and a probability of surviving in greater heats and drought. And we propagated them at our Arboretum at UC Santa Cruz, where we teach. And there are 12,000 of them. And those are the sites, each 500 feet below the other. There are the site preparations. There's Brett Hall, our botanist, doing a species count. The Native Americans joined us, the Washoe. That was their original hunting ground. We became friends and we're working there. This is a present from one of the spiritual leaders, a medicine man. So that's going on. It's going into its third year. And a new species count was just made. And it looks like, in the worst case, about 3 of the 11 we planted lived. That is 1/3 or 1/4. And in the best case, 60 or 70% lived. So we know that we're on target, but this was done without paleobotanical research because we only had 250,000 to work with. And then we're doing one at Santa Cruz. Interesting. This is the Arboretum. We've got ourselves 3 domes. I don't know how we did it, but there they are. And so what we're going to do is plant in the domes your specialists that tend to live in narrow bands, and the generalists will plant outside. And we'll see where we go. It's just at the beginning. I'm not going to stay long with this, but it's a neat place. Then we'll plant trees on the outside to see what will live in the arboreal world. So that's the kind of work we do. So Europe would be when you start to mediate at great scale. These future gardens are what you do when, for every single place, there's somebody botanically wise enough to make one, so that you don't have to feel helpless in your place. We're just beginning this work. The funding has just come in. We're only meeting a little bit of resistance because other people want these domes, but I think we've got it. And finally, where I just came back from the Sichuan province, landed at this airport. I forget the name of it, but it's about 12,000 feet up. I must say I breathed hard. And my doctor's son made me get insurance because he thought they would need an ambulance to get me home. I was, when you get past 80, you get a little shaky. And so, but that didn't happen. This stick was given to me by a Tibetan who understood that I was a little shaky, and he said, "You'll shake less if you have the stick," and which was true. I like those people. we're working with a stunning botanist named Tang Ya, who's a team in the Sichuan University. He selected that site, which is about a 10-minute ride from the airport. That's the farm. There's a Tibetan family runs it. There are different framed areas where we'll plant in. He figures that we'll find our initial species about 3,000 feet down the Mims River. Whoops. This is the family. Tang Ya is at the end. And it's really quite amazing. They get it. They understand what we're after doing, and they will nurture it. So they're not simple fun, they're rather complex people, but they got it and they'll work with it. So we have great good fortune. And that's the sense of the place. It's an almost unearthly beauty. And we were really thankful to go there. The Annenberg Foundation funded us. So, the third thing we work with is governance. How's our time?
3 o'clock.
What time?
About 15 more minutes.
15 minutes.
Oh, okay. Anybody want me to stop? I'll stop and go home.
Finish up this part and then we'll do questions.
That's Kelly. She bosses me around.
I'm the studio manager, so I make sure I keep them in line.
Okay. What you're seeing is the kudzu. The kudzu in Atlanta and other places is exotic. It's known to eat up houses. It will eat up forests and meadows. And we're told that we as human beings are at least as bad and probably much worse an exotic than the kudzu. Why? Because we don't recognize boundaries and because we can invade any system with our intelligence and our technology, take what we want and not bother to give back. The intellectual work of the center takes the form of treating humanity as a biome, with governance acting as an ecotone, a transition zone, mediating between biomes. Governance of this kind would concern itself with how to design a culture fueled by free and renewable energy instead of one relying on growth by extraction. By free energy, we mean human creativity coupled with the sun, the wind, the waves, the core, the mantle, in combination with the excess energies expelled by all living systems. There's enough. So the third layer of work that we take on is, nature doesn't charge a profit. How come it grows without charging a profit? And how come we shrink by charging a profit? How come nature shrinks when we charge a profit? So we're starting to invent and see our way into doing this kind of stuff. There's some doubt that we will survive, as you all know. It's real hard because everybody in this room, except people in there, is anybody here under 25 or under 20, under 30? Well, all of us are going to be bye-bye before the worst of this hits, but our children and our grandchildren will not be. And there are many other forces at work. Someone was asking me about population control, because after all, if population is going to expand, market will expand. We have to increase our food supply. My argument is that if you look at how nature works is most creative when it is most disturbed. And the disturbance of heat like this and the simplification of systems like this give advantage to insects, particularly the virus, particularly the smallest. And that our virologist buddies are telling us that viruses are coming down the pike that's going to make AIDS look like baby talk. So it's not certain that we will be okay. It's not certain that business as usual will continue. not certain that we will continue producing. I would do everything we could to reduce this. So the Center for the Force Majeure is doing this stuff. And we're asking, here we are, only like 4 or 5 people at the university. My wife, Helen, who's presently not well, and Kelly, and our son Josh, and a couple of students. And we're sitting and thinking and plotting and scheming like this. And where are the rest of you? And the rest of you are real busy doing important stuff. And the question then is, how important? So with that, we have another video we would show. It's called Saving the West. Well, should we show it? Or do you want to ask questions?
You guys want to see video, or do you want to start with questions?
How long's the video?
It's a performance piece more than a video now. It has video elements, and it would probably be another 10 minutes minimum.
Yeah, she wants. You want me
Maybe
to?
what we can do is we'll start with questions, and then when we go over, we have a little extra time. Anyone who wants to see the video, we can do that. Does that sound
Sounds
good?
Thanks,
All right, so does anybody want to start with questions?
I have one question. So I think you started with a project where I think you already,
Say it again.
you started with like showing projects, I think where you already kind of like had experience before, and you kind of like, had probably like smaller projects before where you really focused on your topic. And you all showed that you kind of like, I'm kind of curious to figure out how did you manage to kind of like get these allowance and get into the stage that you even have the opportunity to change on a political level, on a big scale level. How did you enable like projects like that?
It's a snap. Okay. All I did was, and Helen did, was say yes in all cases. That's all. So the guy said, "Can you say the green heart?" We said yes.
Career, a lot of work. So.
Explain what that is.
But I'm not being entirely honest. The thing is that if you're a systems thinker, we became systems thinkers in the following way. It's 1969 or 70. Andy Warhol's getting famous for making endangered tigers and all that stuff. And I'm thinking, boy, he's capitalizing on something. And I thought, what's the most endangered species? And Helen and I did an endangered species map. And we said, what's the most endangered species there exists? And it wasn't a species, it was a system, it was a topsoil, and I made earth. And I found that it took me 3 months to make a pile of earth about the size, the 5th size of this room, out of all kinds of manure and all kinds of other stuff. And if it took that much to restore it, and we've got 11 million square miles of factory farm, or mostly factory farm, and we're wrecking our topsoil, and we're releasing the carbon in the air, well, it turned out the reason we did it and the reason we're successful is somehow or other 2 things happen. One, we actually outthink people. Like in the Green Heart. We outthought them. Why? Because we didn't follow planning. We followed the Green Heart. And as you did one, we would get invited to do another. The Green Heart piece got the EU into inviting us to do the Peninsula Europe, which and the Dalai Lama piece got the Green Heart piece going, and we had just won a prize for doing the Nagoya Biennale Prize for doing the Sava River, which runs through former Yugoslavia, and we actually had done a work that, through an odd process, gave the lower Danube over 50% of its clean water, thereby flushing the polluted estuary into the Black Sea. And so that was an unintended consequence. But by embracing unintended consequences like that, one thing leads to another. And the only thing to keep in mind is the environment is your client, and you can't be bullied. And you can't have somebody say, well, you can't do this because the Croatians are going to get pissed at you. Let them. But they didn't actually. Most people, there's an awful lot of editing goes on because people have fantasies that something bad's going to happen. And the bad thing that happens is not the thing they're worried about, but the editing itself. So, does that answer your question?
It answers my question. My second question is that same, because your projects are really about, I mean, systems are big, and so you talk really about big areas of land, what totally makes sense because you talk about the bigger picture and everything, you know, has an effect on each other. But do you think there also like opportunities, or do you have ideas where, you know, people also can act on a small scale?
That's what the future gardens are. That's why we say every place is the story of its own becoming. Like the Sagehen watershed is 9,000 acres. The Santa Cruz campus is 1,200 acres. That's 1/7 of the size of it. So if you can define a place, you can then ask that place what lived when it was hotter and start growing it. Every place has botanists. Every place knows somebody knows the plants, and you don't have to know them all either. And you could be wrong because nature will kill the stuff off that you planted wrong. You do it over again, like a painting. You know, a painting's not good enough. You do it over. You do it over and over, like any good scientist does an experiment. You fail. It teaches you something. You do it over again. You don't quit. So that's how that works. We have one more work. We saved it for last because it's so long and complex. It's called Saving the West. Turns out that the western part of our country, particularly California, has 150 million acres that are fire prone. And those fires wreck the forests. They're the result of bad management, really bad forestry management, across 11 acres, across over 1 million square miles, with 80 million people involved, and all kinds of stuff. And is there something, so we decided to do a local work, and we're working in the Sagehen watershed that you saw. Well, the why don't you put it on? Do people want us to, are you up for one more work or are you not? If not, I'm okay. I'm going to read most of this. Okay. The West was harvested from a monocultural perspective. The trees return after clearing or a crown fire thin, crowded, very dense. Density combined with drought invites fire. That used to have sound. Crown fire becomes uncontrollable. Vast amounts of CO2 enter the atmosphere. The tsunami of fire unstoppable until all energy is exhausted. Counter forces are available. Imagine a response to these 160 million acres of forest, some intact but many overcrowded and stressed, where over the long run, by design, catastrophe can be flipped into opportunity. This is a picture of bark beetle as they spread through Sierra Nevada. This is in Sagehen. Excessive growth is thinned by hand at an average of 1,000 per acre. Excessive growth is also cleared by machine at about 650 per acre. After thinning, before first growth, the place looks like terrible. But first growth comes back quickly. Ground cover returns, rich and resilient. Then controlled fires or managed fire benefits the whole. What happens here is the same thing that the Native Americans, the first people, understood. The reason they understood that if they controlled burning and the trees weren't too close together, crown fires were not possible. Hold it there. Crown fires were not possible, and fires self-extinguished. But something else happened. New growth happened within a year or two. Who harvested the new growth? But the first people who were there, plus other game animals like the brown deer and sometimes the bear. And so they had a double harvest for the cost of lighting a match intelligently. This is, we need that kind of intelligence. So at Sagehen, they're experimenting with this and doing so successfully. Next. Well, then chipping comes, acre by acre, giant amounts of chipping. Next. And in industry, the result is turned into building materials. There are factories all over doing this in Germany and other places. Here, not much. When you do that, you turn the thing into profit twice, becoming both building materials and carbon credits. And this is the kind of stuff you build. Now, they're now figuring out how to build wooden buildings over 20 stories high. Read it. If 1 cubic meter of wood is in a building, it effectively sequesters 1 ton of CO2, then a 20-story building will act as a carbon sink for 3,100 tons of carbon. And 1,200 tons of CO2 emitted in construction of a 20-story concrete building is prevented, and the net difference is 4,300 tons. If we do this over 1.5 million acres, then we would start to make wooden buildings. We would take concrete making out of the equation. We would take a lot of steel out of the equation, which is extraction type stuff, and we would then be using the excess wood in the forest itself, and that would make the forest more healthy. So, next. When the risk of catastrophic fire disappears and ground fires self-extinguish, then the ecosystem is transformed into an open canopy forest with meadowlands randomly appearing and carbon is sequestered, wood products abundant. Then the act of harvesting trees both nourishes the ecosystem, providing renewable material that revitalizes the economy while simultaneously storing massive amounts of carbon in the built environment. Keep in mind that 1 gigaton of carbon drops the carbon level of the world 1 point. So if we're 400 parts per million, and we drop it like in the Tibetan plateau, we drop it 3 points, then we drop from 400 to 397, and we can start to slow the process. We slow it twice. Next. A grand synthesis needs to be designed and put on the ground. Many parts are in place. Industry, knowledge, science, with the exception of a viable market, yet all are separate, each happening in a different place. We propose a new category entitled Whole System Sites, where a grand synthesis can occur and a guiding metaphor appears. Assisting adaptation is collaboration with nature. Next. Now, we came in second in the big Buckminster Fuller Challenge grant with we're the only artists. And what we proposed was you had to drop the entropy in all major systems in the planet for survival. And so how do you drop planetary entropy? And Europe suggests one way. And the MacArthur asked one of the Fuller folk how to help structure their $100 million ask. And the Bucky Fuller people called us up, since some of them are on our board, and said, listen, you fit, so why don't you apply? Well, I advised nobody to apply, but we applied. And the chancellor, I walked into the chancellor's office, told him about it, and he said, oh boy, okay, he loves $100 million, Why? not because he thought the environment was important, but because he thought 30 million go into the university. He's a greedy sucker as our chancellor. But one should not be afraid of chancellors. But he calls together a group. Look at Kelly Groom. But also he's knowledgeable and helpful, and he put together the team of senior advisors, and about 2 months later we get our MacArthur in. And it's now accepted, and we'll now find if we go to the next step. But this was what went into the MacArthur. And about California also went in. And I'm going to read, we'll end with this, it takes a minute or two. Go ahead. Confronting a $1.5 billion economic irrationality in California fire control. For instance, 15 million acres in California alone are at risk of catastrophic fire at a $1.5 billion a year containment cost, which doesn't work very well. If 1 million acres of overgrown forest were thinned yearly, like at Sagehen, at an average cost of $1,000 an acre and an annual cost of $1 billion a year, then we're looking at a $1 billion allocated yearly for 15 years. Fire risk is reduced by 7% every year, mostly eliminating catastrophic fire in California, co-equally reducing the cost of firefighting. Then these lands, over the long term, ecologically sustainable, adapted to global warming as it happens, creating jobs, often in small industry, often for the indigenous people who have historic knowledge in assisting forests to continue. Well, this is an afterward. Taken a 50-year view, the $1.5 billion a year spent for fire control adds up to about $75 billion if the $1 billion extra is spent yearly for 15 years to thin forests, causing fire costs to normalize over 15 million acres. Then after these 15 years, the cost of fire repression reduces drastically, and the majority of forests in California are saved. Taking this larger view, the savings come to about $37.5 billion. Yet, we discover that no one wants to spend the extra $15 billion. Finally, in the prior year, the hottest year in this state's history, over 300,000 acres burned. Not accounted for increasing heat and drought, in 10 years, 3 million acres will burn, and in 50 years, all 15 million endangered acres in the state of California will burn, saving $15 billion, but at a cost of $75 billion. And for what? So, that's the ask. That's our response to their ask. We say that if they'll kindly toss $100 billion on us, we'll take it on. 100 million. So that's the kind of stuff we're messing with. It is possible, I promise you, to deal with this, but you have to be outside of a particular discipline, and you have to give up the idea of fixing your patch, external to where your patch is, the system in it, and the responsibility you have to the system that your patch that you are protecting or helping with exists in. So that's the story. Thanks.
I have a question. You guys feel free to leave if you need to for time, but I have a question. So, you and I were chatting a little bit earlier, and you were saying, well, Microsoft,
talk a little louder. When you get older, you get a little deaf.
What's that? Okay, so we were chatting a little earlier.
Yes.
And you and I were having a conversation. Well, what is Microsoft doing about this?
And
my question to you is, how would you see an entity like a Microsoft or?
It's very simple. we would call it the Microsoft solution, and they would give us the first 12 million that we need to proceed with. It's very straightforward. Once we did that, you would find that other Rauschenberg and other foundations would also. We need the initial amount, and then that kind of money would double and redouble. Then you would see that this kind of thinking could be propagated and applied. You can see where it can be applied. We apply it in 3 continents, and we set out it can be applied at every single place that can be called a place, and we've got to start. And we need the resources to put together the team to rethink government in terms of biomes and ecotones, so that our processes of extraction, so we build government that returns as much as it takes, and the rewards are when you're dealing with exergy, when you return somewhat more than you took. And so a whole other kind of reward system has to be built. Well, you have to think this through, and we haven't thought through the metaphors. We just laid out the first one. We haven't thought through the kind of structures. This requires a team. It requires another 2 or 3 years before we could do a powerful publication. We just need help. But people don't think artists do this kind of stuff, but we do, and are.
And besides money, do you think would there be anything besides, like something like Microsoft could be used for, like making advantage of like the skill set or the technology, where you see, that.
My intuition is that the invention that made Microsoft exist in the first place could well infuse some of the work that we're doing. So of course I see a role in it. We first went to Google about 5 years ago saying, hey guys, how about mapping the world where you make steps when every meter the ocean rises so everybody can see their houses, and then make a second level of mapping where the drought's going to be so one can plan for food and stuff, and make a third level of mapping of what will happen to the rivers. And Google said, well, how will that benefit us? So it's true that they want to do no harm, but they also don't want to do any damn thing at all that doesn't help them. So I walked away, but I wasn't given any choice. So I can't make a claim that I really walked away. I was sort of rejected. But some company has to be big enough to take a risk. This company exists because the initial folk took risks, astonishing risks. And then the bigger you get, the more risk averse you get. Then the more evidence you need for success before you risk anything. My position is the evidence is in, we're going down. And then the question is, are you willing to risk going all the way down? Or are you willing to risk going a third of the way down? And that's where we sit.
Yeah, I really appreciate your really long-term thinking rather than it's just direct action. I think that's something what we in general should do, work towards.
But the amount of money we're asking will not break the company. I mean, they spend that much on their bus system, for God's sakes. So it's not exactly a shocking amount of funding. So if anybody's got more arguments, I'm up for them, or questions.
Maybe show the book and explain what that is.
This just came out.
Came out this Saturday. It's our life work. And the last chapter, which is called the Force Majeure, deals with governance and these big ideas, and poses the kind of problem. And actually, there's a riff at the end about what would a government look like, I mean, as I said over lunch or earlier, we'd have to outlaw war because fixing Europe would cost what a Bush war cost. You know, I mean, we can't afford that. You see, in my judgment, you can't afford not to be doing what we're talking about. You just can't afford it.
I have another question. So it seems as though the millennial generation has been very vocal about climate change and the environment. Have you guys found that, you know, being able to access that generation versus other generations that are more resistant?
Not yet.
Momentum there.
Not yet. There's a problem with categories. When you're categorized as an artist, they want to know if you paint landscape paintings. If you read some of the articles on us, we are landscape artists. But nobody told us we had to sell. I'm a painter. I made life-size figures when I was 14 and 15. So I know how to do all that stuff. I'm trained right out of Cennino Cennini's textbook in the 14th century. So I know how to do all that stuff. But the point is that that's not what we artists need to be doing. You know, we need to be doing what you can't. Like on the Green Heart. We did what their planners couldn't. And that's why we need to be funded this way. Somebody will come by and do it, maybe not. But I think a company like this would benefit way more than the amount of money they would put in. So, but I don't see the directors of this company stepping forward and saying, yeah.
They may be watching online.
Exactly.
Well, maybe.
Yeah.
Really, oh, I forgot we have spies up there.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks for coming all the way out here. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.